Welcome back to Drug Dealing. This is episode 6. It's Shivu and Kenny this time, and we have a very interesting topic for you about the FDA. Should the FDA be independent? What's the scope of the FDA? How should they really be operating? And, really all of this was an interesting kind of offline discussion between me and Kenny, reflecting on all of the drama that's happened at the FDA since Trump's appointment of Marty Makary as the head of the FDA. Marty Makary bringing in, a very controversial figure in Vinay Prasad, his exit, his return, the political pressure to kick him out, and, his kind of quiet re-entrance to the FDA, all the controversial regulatory decisions that have come across the new FDA's desk and the biotech reaction to it, all of that was so interesting to us from the standpoint of instability, right? Which is a common theme, I think, throughout all of these events, and what that instability. We want to talk about what that instability means for the sector, and potentially, how we can rethink the industry's relationship to the FDA, which is a huge critical component of the medicine innovation infrastructure, let's say. So that's what we're going to dive into today. We hope you find this super interesting as we did. Kenny, you want to add any notes to that?
Yeah, excited to get into this with you, Shivu. I think also what's worth noting is a lot of our conversation today is through the lens of drug development. So there are other aspects of the FDA we're not going to get into, food regulation, some other things going on. And also regarding some of the political appointees, a lot of this did start with the selection of President Trump with RFK Jr. as HHS head. And so there are other things going on in the healthcare division of the government and the regulatory bodies that are involved that are also notable, things like CDC and other things. We're not going to get into that today. Today is very much about through the lens of drug development, what it could mean for patients and what's going on, and what are some perhaps optimal operating models. That's, I think, how the conversation might go.
And it's not because we don't find those other topics interesting. It's just because we are biopharma professionals. I don't think we're the best people equipped to give really incisive, thoughtful analyses on those topics. But all of it is super important, and I think are all connected, and as you'll see, I think from our discussion, really connected in an interesting way. Okay, so I thought maybe, Kenny, where we could start is a little bit of a timeline of what's actually happened at the FDA since Marty Makary's appointment, and just kind of give the audience a little bit of a flavor of kind of all the events that have occurred since his appointment. So we put together a little timeline, actually, of all these different events, and we can kind of touch on this really quick. We won't go through this in too much detail, but I think this is helpful in giving everybody a sense of, what's been going on and why things have been so crazy. And so it all starts in March 25th of this year. The Senate confirms Marty Makary to become the FDA head. Peter Marks, the top vaccine regulator, leaves, 3 days later. Obviously, with RFK's appointment to HHS, the vaccine topic is obviously very top of mind, and clearly there are very diverging views about the value of vaccines and how they should be regulated, which kind of makes sense. There's mass layoffs at the FDA, which is already, I think, even previous to these layoffs, very understaffed. As you can see with, how many, BLAs and SBLAs and NDAs have, been extended and didn't meet their PDUFA dates, some of them due to the fact that the FDA just didn't have enough bandwidth to address those, which is something we'll talk about. And then in May 6th, Vinay Prasad becomes the head of CBER, the biologics division of the FDA. Just a quick background on Vinay Prasad, right? He's a hem-onc doctor, and publishes a lot about issues in medicine. A very controversial figure. I mean, I would describe him as someone who is a firebrand, maybe is the right word for it, who Kenny, I've told Kenny this, but I kind of view him as like he positions himself a bit of like a a randomized clinical trial maximalist, in some ways. Like, this is the gold standard in every study, regardless of the context, should be run with a randomized phase 3 study. Which, I think, as we know as drug developers, that's not always ethical and it's not always feasible, especially for certain diseases, right? So he's, had a lot of commentary previously about how, you know, pharma and biotech are bad for the industry. And I mean, I'm over summarizing kind of his points a bit because we don't need to get into them in so much detail. But he has largely been a strong critic of the industry, especially.
And Shiva, what I think is I'm glad you detailed that. What's interesting to note about him is he did seem to be in a lot of ways um, bearish on some of the FDA's regulatory guidelines for some of these things. And as you mentioned, an RCT maximalist is probably the right way to think about it. But with no genuine experience in the industry, it's easy to take draconian blanket views and say this is the right way to do it. But what we'll see later in your timeline is he actually started the job and then things changed. And then I guess there was a boomerang effect. And it just reminds you how difficult some of these things are. It's easy to come and say things, be on a sideline, have a blog, and say like, oh, they should do this, and I'm an MD, so therefore you should listen to me. Very different when you get in the seat and actually are responsible for doing these things.
100%. I often think, in politics, they always talk about the difference between like an activist and when those activists, win a political seat and actually have to operate. And I think in his uh, experience, like that was a real stark contrast, as you can see, right? I mean, I think the fact that there's real realities with like just being someone who's poking holes and stuff and being a critic versus having to sit at the helm of a large organization and have to deal with the day-to-day of operating. For my Substack on Big Pharma Sharma, I actually wrote a little bit about his appointment back when it happened. And I think I came to it with like a negative view, obviously, just given, some of his opinions about the industry. But I mean, I would say, to his credit, he was saying all the right things during his lead up to when he got appointed, right? That, hey, randomized control trials might not be beneficial for everybody. There's a stark difference between, kind of the things like Macri wanted to do versus what he wanted to do. Macri was doing a lot of posturing about, hey, we're going to reduce clinical trial timelines to like a few months, and we want to accelerate, the rate of approvals, and use AI, as we're showing here on June 2nd, 2025, use AI to speed up regulatory reviews. And I think Prasad too was saying all the right things, but I think where this conversation really was interesting to us was there was seemingly a delta between what both of them were saying, obviously, but also what they were saying and how they were acting with the regulatory decisions that they made. And so I think the most interesting one here that really started a lot of debate was Sarepta being forced to halt distribution of their gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy after there were 3 deaths in patients. Right, so they were asked to suspend distributing the drug. Sarepta kind of, very very politely said, "No, we're good. We're gonna keep distributing this." And then eventually they did stop for a while. But, if you read the reporting, and I think there's still like more reporting that needs to come out about this, it sounds like, folks at Sarepta who had, connections to government officials were able to kind of back channel and put kind of Vinay Prasad on the radar of, higher powers within the administration. Specifically, there's a woman who's kind of kind of right wing influencer by the name of Laura Loomer. Through one way or another, this lady has kind of like been someone who Trump has kind of allied. She's allied herself with Trump and has his ear, in somewhat of a like Rasputin sort of way, right? Back if you're
Yeah.
thinking about the old Russian Empire, and she started, painting Prasad as this like left wing liberal who hates Trump and doesn't care about, his ideologies and things. And eventually, there's seemingly political pressure to kick him out, right? Which is where kind of he resigned in July 29th, 2025. But then, very quietly re-entered the fray in August, right? So, I mean, a lot of upheaval and instability. This guy who was already controversial comes in. I would say most of the sector had a negative view, or at least a let's wait and see type of view on how he acts. And political pressures kick him out, but then he comes back, very quietly, right? In between that, which is another topic we'll discuss, was this rejection of Replimune's RP1, which we'll dive into a little bit later. This was, not some big company. I mean, Sarepta is a decently sized company, I would say. Replimune's a really small biotech company who was kind of on the at the goal line, basically, of getting their novel drug approved for cutaneous melanoma after failure of a PD-1 inhibitor. It would seem that the FDA kind of pulled the rug from them at the last minute, saying like, "Hey, your study's not good enough," even though previously with the previous administration and all that, they had agreements on the plan and had checked all the boxes that the FDA had asked of them. And so that's a topic we'll double click into in a little bit, but I think is very emblematic of where the inconsistency in guidance and flux of regulators and leadership at an organization that is so important, like the FDA is, can really make a significant negative impact on how drugs get developed.
Yeah, Shivu, I think it's the Replimune story is interesting to me because for folks who don't know it as well, and you brought this to my attention, I think you know the story certainly more than I do. One of the things that's very clear when you look into the patient population they're trying to address with their drug is that they don't have a lot of good options otherwise. So that's what's scary about this. See, sometimes the FDA doesn't operate in a vacuum. They will sometimes reject things when they know there's a pipeline of 5 other programs that are up for potential approval for the same patient population. It's easier to do that because you have the luxury of options. In this situation, that's not the case. And so this is a staggering case where I think it's worth getting into. And not to double click too far into Prasad, but what I want to remind people is how large the FDA is, thousands of employees. But for anyone who's had a job before, what is it like when you get a new boss who's been on the periphery, the outside of that particular work you're doing, comes in, is there for maybe 11 days, is there for a short time, actually, rather, and then resigns and then comes back after 11 days? Just think about it, what it means for yourself. I've been in situations where there's been leadership changes or my direct manager had been changed or something like that. And what immediately happens is there's an extended period of no action. I do not have a direct impact to patients. That is not the case with the FDA. So having no action, having this turmoil, having this mental whipsaw back and forth, it doesn't spell for a good path forward for those who are in the role who are actually trying to serve patients. That is what the ultimate goal of the FDA is, to do that. And for that, you do need some consistency and some stability. So I just want to remind people that having managers swap in and out, just think of your own professional experience, what that's like. I've been there. Budgets are frozen. Typically, nothing happens. If there's a holiday around, it stretches out even further. It's not ideal. And this is the FDA. It's one of the most important regulatory bodies in the nation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good flow into the next part of our discussion about like why is this important, right? Why is this instability important? Like, how does it affect all parts of the healthcare ecosystem, right? I mean, from you know the most all of this this whole ecosystem should be in service of patients, and part of drug developers' roles and the FDA's role, right, is to ensure that drugs that are safe and effective get approved, and there's more options for patients and their physicians to think through when they have a condition that requires medical intervention, right? Um, I think too, maybe like a subtle point that doesn't really get talked about enough is like how instability, like what we've seen at the FDA during this Macri Prasad administration, affects like planning for drugs, right? I mean, we are an industry that, it takes us from start to finish, like can take 15 years to turn around a product, right? From idea to approval, 10, sometimes 10, sometimes 12, but it could take up to 15 years sometimes to get a drug approved, from concept to approval. And so you are making very thoughtful, conscious investments many years into the future, assuming that there's some level of stability there that will, create a regulatory path that your drug is going to get approved, right? I think especially when you get to kind of the near finish line of it, it's really hard to go, well, you know, I think I've checked all the boxes for what my, clinical study is. This is what the standard was before, and the standard just completely changes under your feet, right? It's really hard to make assessments of that, right? It's really hard for, VC firms to sit there and go, well, how do we invest in, this oncology company, or how much do we invest in this oncology company if, phase 2 single arm studies are just, there's a, locked door there, right? And we have to, we can only get approved with phase 3, right? Phase 3s are much larger studies. It's a much higher evidence burden. That means more money, more patients, larger studies, et cetera. Even for bigger companies and how they think about where to prioritize their portfolio, right? Should, if in an instance where, phase 2 single arm studies are, no longer viable, if I'm a big company, I'm probably going to deprioritize those, right? Why put in the effort to get a drug approved for, a rare disease with like a high unmet need patient population if I don't feel confidence in the consistency of the guidance from the regulators about what qualifies as an approvable study, approvable endpoint, and what doesn't.
I think that's well said, and what is also perhaps not as clear to folks who don't work in the industry is the impact a single FDA decision can make on the industry, which you've highlighted a few times already. Just thinking about how a lot of the drug development is funded, Shivu, because as you mentioned, you may go a decade before generating any income. So what you're doing is you're using funding from investors. Typical investors involve things like VC and maybe public equity investors like hedge funds. You need that funding because you know you're years away from something getting approved. And if I was a VC investor, where I have to think about, okay, you're going to do a single arm study because that's what the FDA has greenlit for you. You're okay to move forward. Single arm study means you enroll actually less patients because you don't have a control arm. Maybe you use natural history. Maybe there's already an established understanding of how these patients will progress. And because there aren't many options and the disease is severe, this makes sense. So, from an investor's perspective, you have a very clear line of sight to how much money that company will need to achieve success and get the drug approved, and what you need as part of a syndicate, as part of a team of investors to raise on their behalf so they can continue and execute on that as quickly as possible. Now, if the FDA comes in and says, like Replimune, for example, with the single arm study, no, we don't approve of that. Well, if Replimune had any competitors, which by the way, competitive forces is one of the best ways to deal with better drugs, lower prices. I mean, this is an old economic aspect that we understand now. Why would a competitor enter the fray? The first thing that's going to happen is, well, if I want to challenge Replimune because I think I can be 20% better. Well, wait a second. If they just got rejected, I don't know what that means for me. And if I had a certain capital runway for how much money is needed, that might have just increased 70%, 50%, a double. I don't know. And what happens is from an investor, you're saying, I don't even know what the FDA wants anymore. So why would I put my neck out there and invest in this, even though I may feel personally connected to the patients and what's going on? Why would I do that? Why would instead wouldn't I go towards a place where perhaps the pathway is more clear? And I have what's not what is we're discussing today, Shiva, is regulatory risk. I want to avoid that as much as possible. And the FDA, because of its recent actions, by the way, your timeline actually only highlighted 5 months, March to August. And I don't even think it ran through the end of August. In 5 months, look how much change came in one of the largest and most important healthcare regulatory bodies in the nation. So how is us as an investor, how are sponsors to make long-term plans? So that's what's scary, Shivu. This isn't about dollars and cents. This is about patient lives. In my perspective, how is a sponsor supposed to commit to something when the FDA itself has commitments that change on whimsy? That's the scariest aspect of this. And I think as we get into other things, perhaps Replimune will be a good example. I think it'll be more clear.
Yeah. So should we get into the Replimune example then? Yeah. And again, there's so many, case studies we could have looked at. as we saw on the timeline. I think the Replimune one, was very, very interesting because it really feels like, at least to me, and maybe I'm a little biased, was it felt like they got the rug pulled out from under them. Okay, so where to start with this Replimune thing. So maybe I'll just give a bit of like a voiceover of what they were doing. So Replimune is a small biotech company. They were advancing a type of drug, what's called an oncolytic virus. So basically, patients' tumors get directly injected with a virus that goes in and lyses the tumor cells. It also, kind of uploads a bunch of genes into those cells and expresses a bunch of inflammatory factors that stimulate the immune system to your own immune system to pull in other immune cells that would eventually, kill off the tumor. So this was a drug called RP1 that was in combination with a very common kind of standard of care for melanoma, which is an anti-PD-1. So typically, a drug like nivolumab or pembrolizumab. And so what's common in, this melanoma space, right, is that if you are basically, or generally in oncology broadly, right, if you're studying a drug in a disease setting where there are no established standards of care for that patient population, typically you can get what's called an accelerated approval based off of a single arm phase 2 study, right? So there's no randomized arm that a patient would, potentially get. So there's study drug and non-study drug. There's no non-study drug arm in a single arm study. And part of that is because there's a really high unmet need in those patient populations, right? Especially when we think about cancer, those patients are unfortunately really sick. They're very frail a lot of times. They don't have a lot of life left in them unless there's an intervention. Oftentimes, they get put into clinical trials where there's a potential chance at them, responding well to a new drug, which was, what RP1 was trying to do, right? And there's precedent for this before. So maybe it'd be helpful for me to show a slide from Replimune's investor presentation that kind of highlights a little bit about what the treatment paradigm looks like for the indication that they were going after. So this is a slide again from Replimune's corporate deck. The disease they were going after was cutaneous melanoma, and so typically what happens in cutaneous melanoma once it's metastatic in frontline, first line therapy, these are kind of the options that you can get. It's various combinations of the PD-1 drugs that we mentioned before with another type of immuno-oncology drug, either, an anti-CTLA-4 or, this new modality of an anti-LAG-3. Patients respond pretty well to those, but once they relapse after, or if they don't respond, after getting a PD-1, and this is common across all of oncology, really, there's not really a ton of options left for these patients. And typically there's, a dynamic in oncology, right, where, if you fail a certain mechanism of action, you're unlikely to respond all that well once you get that same mechanism of action again, right? And that's due to kind of how cancer works, right? Cancer, you can think of it as like a state of kind of hyper evolution in some ways. So when you throw certain drugs at it, the cancer is rapidly evolving to figure out, how do I get around, this cancer? So it's not too much unlike, like drug resistant bacteria in some ways. Like you give, an antibiotic, you have a bacterial infection, your doctor might prescribe you some antibiotics. Maybe they don't work because this bacteria has already figured out how to get around this drug, and you have to get successively newer, better versions of a drug that might kill that bacteria. And so oncology, again, I'm really oversimplifying this just so that more of our audience can grasp this, but cancer does the same thing, right? Cancer is almost like a living, thinking being in a lot of ways. You'll throw chemotherapy at it. You might kill 95% of the cells. There might be a little bit of cells that get left behind, and those cells that survive kind of figure out, how to avoid getting killed by that drug.
And
over
it's
over
really
the long
hard,
term.
and Shivu, because you're so deep into this, it's good to remind people, why can't they eliminate all of it? Well, many cancer cells have so much similarity with healthy tissue. One of the things I was talking about with a KOL once on a call, and it was in preclinical studies, and he was saying that I really don't like looking at any preclinical data for oncology because I have the best drug for tumors. He said, just take bleach and pour it over all the assays. And he says, all the tumors will be gone. He said, so will your healthy tissues. He said, so I don't really care about that preclinical stuff. And I think it's just a reminder there's so much overlap. And that's why almost in some ways, when I think of cancer biology, I think of it as somewhat sinister biology. It's trying to survive at the cost of us.
Yeah. I always, my friends who are not as immersed in biopharma as we are always ask me like, haven't we cured cancer yet? Haven't we spent all this money on it? Like, why haven't we cured cancer? And I always tell them like, hey, it's because I think we have a really good understanding of how cancer works. We have spent a lot of money collectively, like from research all the way to like approved drugs, that whole funnel. Like we spent billions and billions of dollars on it. And I think we really do have a good understanding of how to fight cancer. It's just a moving target. It's not something that's stationary. Anything you throw at it, it it figures out how to beat it, and it creates another set of problems. So it's really hard. I think cancer is one of the hardest things that our industry's worked on, and despite how hard it is, I think we've done an incredible job developing really effective drugs like anti-PD-1s that are literally approved across pretty much every solid tumor you can think of, and have, collectively extended, years and years of life for really sick patients, and stuff in like blood cancers where literally you can get cured of a blood cancer. You can get, an antibody plus chemotherapy and, live, your cancer can go and you can live a normal life. You can get a cell therapy that gives you an option that, if you didn't have any options, that thing will cure you of your disease and you can go on and live a normal life. So I think we've done an incredible job as an industry fighting cancer. It's just a really, really uphill battle. And despite all that, I think we've still done a really good job. This melanoma one is a really great example of it though, right? So after you fail PD-1s, there's really not a ton of great options available, so you can see kind of in Replimune slide, like what are the response rates as second line options for some of these patients. And it's important to keep in mind, like the patients in their study were all of this variety. Like they had been exposed to a PD-1, failed it, had also gotten CTLA-4s as well, and like haven't weren't able to respond to it. And so the response rates here are really minuscule, right? Like 12% response rate if you get, if you add on anti-LAG3 to it. And, it's not much, right? The only drug that's approved right now for patients who fail a prior PD-1 is this drug called lifileucel. It goes under the brand name Amtagvi. It's developed by this company called Iovancer cell therapy company. And it's a type of therapy called the tumor infiltrating lymphocyte therapy, where they take a big chunk of a patient's tumor, send it back to the manufacturing facility of the company. The company like liberates all the little T cells that have found their way to kill that tumor, and put them in a dish in a bioreactor, culture them up, give them a bunch of cytokines to make them hungry and active again, and freeze that down into a product and ship that back out to the patient. All of that can take over a month to do, right? And it's a good drug, as you can see. And you're getting a 31% overall response rate. It does come with a high amount of AEs, but typically once you make it through that therapy, you can your AEs are pretty minimal after that. But again, it can take a month. It can take longer than a month, start to finish, right? It can take up to 2 months, even longer. And when you're dealing with patients who have cancer, they don't have that. A lot of them don't have that long to live, right? Their disease can destabilize very quickly, and they can progress very rapidly. And so if you look at the launch metrics, even for what lifileucel has done in the market, it's been pretty low so far. It's been pretty slow because you have to very carefully select the patient that's healthy enough to make it through that 2.5 months. It's also very expensive. It's just list price is like $515,000. It doesn't take into consideration the hospital costs. It doesn't take into consideration, the post-infusion care of, getting infused with IL-2 and, other things that you would need. And so again, it can only be administered at very specialized academic centers as well. And so it's not always an option for every patient, which was nice with kind of where RP1 plus PD-1 was slotting in, right? Here was another therapy that didn't have all these restrictions that this cell therapy had, that could be administered in more places, more settings, and give people an option after they fail a PD-1 that might be better suited for them. And so naturally, the company talked to the FDA. This was in the previous administration, went and spoke to them and said, "Hey, look, we're going to do a phase 2 single arm study with patients who failed standard of care and frontline. Our endpoints are going to be duration of response and ORR." And what the FDA does, and in the previous administration, this was the standard, right, is you need to have your confirmatory study already ongoing before you can get approval for your single arm phase 2 study. And so that single arm phase 2 study is what's called an accelerated approval, right? It's only for these diseases that are really high unmet need. You use an endpoint that is not like a hard outcomes endpoint. So overall response rate, which is just how many tumors were shrunk by the treatment, um, versus something like overall survival, right? Which is like how long did the patient actually live versus kind of a comparator arm. Um, you do that so you can get the drug on market a lot faster. Patients win because there's a new option that could potentially extend their life. But the FDA requests that they wait for kind of the harder outcomes studies, right? So the confirmatory study where you might study it based on the endpoint might be progression-free survival or overall survival, and based on the outcome of that, you get your previous approval confirmed or not, right? And so that's kind of the standard that was set in place. It wasn't always that way. In a previous era, there were a lot of companies that would get approved in an accelerated approval based on a single arm study, and really drag their feet when in running the confirmatory phase 3, and the FDA would kind of never get confirmed that this drug was actually better than standard of care. And so that was a big push for the previous administration under Biden, where they were like, "Hey, look, we can't have these like hanging approvals anymore, where you just never ran your confirmatory phase
Mhm.
3. You got to have that study up and running, and we got to see that data at some point when it reads out to know whether your accelerated approval gets to continue, or we have to pull it." And so that's kind of the situation that Replimune was in. They had this guidance from the previous administration about you can get approved on your single arm study. They had their phase 3 study, which was randomized, already up and running. But unfortunately, when they submitted all their paperwork, they submitted their filing, the FDA came back and said, "No, your study isn't good enough. Like, we want to see, it lacks a comparator, and so how do we know whether the drug works or not?" Which I think is like reasonable in some sense if that was the guidance before, right? But it wasn't the guidance before, and it's hard, right? You can't. If they started this study 2 years ago, how are they going to get to the point where they're filing this drug and the FDA says, "Well, you should have randomized it." Well, you should have told me that 2 years ago. Now it's like it's pretty tough, right? And they also started their pivotal study, their pivotal confirmatory study, which was already underway. They had a randomized arm, and more importantly, it was in the same line of therapy as where they were trying to get their accelerated approval, which isn't always the case.
Yeah. Shivu, let me ask you this. So there's some good writers out there, things like people like Adam Feuerstein at Stat, who I feel does a decent job at keeping many entities, at holding them accountable for actions. And I've seen him be critical of the FDA, I've seen him be critical of investors, of sponsors, things like that. I'm thinking of people like that. And so, there is a general opaqueness between sponsors and FDA's interactions. And so let me just take the other side for a little bit here and assume that the FDA has been consistent. Has there been anything from Replimune that suggested there was a hint of risk in this design, or was it pretty clear? And the reason why I ask is typically when you're the first sponsor or first drug developer in a space, as you mentioned, there were some regulatory advantages. And when you get accelerated approval, when you get these types of regulatory advantages, it actually brings you closer to the FDA because your engagement is much tighter. And so it is harder to have missteps. It's still possible. And so what I'm trying to understand is, do you think Replimune made any mistakes? Do you think they were haphazard or perhaps even hasty with what they were doing with their trial designs? Was there anything on the sponsor's end where you felt, now there's risk here? And let's also add another thing too. I haven't had the opportunity yet to review KOL impressions of Replimune's approach. Did you find that KOLs were generally on board with what they're trying to do? Because that's also a great barometer for how they might use the drug, as long as the data is satisfactory to what they're trying to answer.
Yeah, so great points. I think for your first one, based on what I was able to find, and this is even like commentary from Replimune CEO as well. I think they had an investor call about it. He also did a short interview with Brad Lonkar for Biotech TV. From their perspective, they had met all the checkpoints that the FDA asked for them, and they were really taken by surprise, like when they got the letter back saying, when they got the CRL back, right, saying, hey, this study's not good enough. And so I don't think there was anything that they did wrong, right? You are always, you're always trying to like meet the expectations of the regulator, right? And so the standards that was set out for them is pretty much identical to the standards set out for previous drugs in that setting. So if you look at Iovance, for instance, Amtagvi, the drug that we talked about before, they were approved based on an accelerated approval in the same line of therapy and started, had their phase 3 confirmatory study up and running, and they got an approval. Obviously, that was in, the previous administration, not under Macri, right? So the only thing that really changed significantly was the people in charge. And that's challenging, right? I mean, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it, right? You can say, hey, it's really unfair that, this company, small company, doesn't have a ton of resources, did everything right, and got to, they think about like if you were taking the SATs, right, and you filled it out, you submitted it to the testing authority, and they changed the way that the scoring system was like right after you submitted the test, right? So instead of you getting points for guessing on your scores, you get negative points for wrong answers instead of no points for wrong answers, right? That completely changes the way that like your testing strategy would have been on that test, right? And so that's kind of what it feels like to me. Like they just got new bosses in charge, and the new boss was like, nah, I'm good. This isn't the way we're doing things anymore. And there's some reporting, I think Feuerstein also had some reporting that it wasn't necessarily Prasad who kind of came in at the last minute. It was like another individual, Rick Paisder, who kind of came in at the last minute and put the block on this melanoma approval, which I think also just speaks to some of the instability, right? Like you're expecting to deal with like one chain of command within the organization, and there's influence from other parts of the chain of command in the organization as well. So I mean, that's one way of looking at like, hey, they did everything right and it's really unfair. The other way of looking at it is like, well, this happens and it's just bad timing, so sucks to suck, you got to start over again. And I think like that aspect of it is like just really unfair to patients, right? Like if we're going to be really focused on like how do we get drugs approved that are safe and effective, having the attitude of just like, oh well, these guys got unlucky, it just happens, isn't good enough, right? And I think you see that sentiment in the KOL community as well. To address your second question, a lot of melanoma KOLs like wrote a big letter and signed it and submitted it and kind of circulated it around like one of the journals about their disapproval of the way this approval was handled, and their support for the drug and the desire for it to treat their patients as well, right? And so I think you see from the KOL community that they felt like this was an option that they wanted to have for their patients, given the unmet need in the market.
And I'm trying to think about myself. By the way, it's good to know that there was KOL uproar, I guess you could say, on this and how this is navigated, because I bet many of them were excited to start using this for their patients. And so the first thing I think about is if I was a patient or I had a loved one who was affected by this disease, the first thing I've been thinking about is, okay, I was expecting something on the horizon. And as you mentioned, time is important to these patients because a tumor can progress. I mean, the first thing I'd be thinking about is how demoralizing it is to think something was on the horizon, something new that I could try and give me hope and extend another day. All we can really ask for in life is a shot at the average lifespan. I can get to 76 to 78, that's all I can ask for. The rest I can't. And that's what this drug could maybe help some of these patients have a better chance at achieving. I'm thinking from their perspective, what would I do? I think the first thing I would do is see if there's any other alternative treatment options where you can involve in a study, and then also reach out to Replimune. I don't know if compassionate use is the right way to get involved with it, or if I can ask to be involved in the studies. Because maybe one of them are single armed, or the other one, the phase 3 you mentioned, does have a control arm. If you get enrolled in that, there's no guarantee you'll actually get the drug, and so that's what's challenging. But from a patient's perspective, this must be nothing short of a gut punch, where you think like, I thought we were okay to have something, and now we're not.
100%. And remember, this is a small company too, right? It's not something where they don't have the runway or the finances to go, okay, we'll figure out kind of an elegant way of getting this drug approved. It might take us an additional year or so. Maybe we can move the patients to like a compassionate use sort of program and keep manufacturing drug for them. I mean, they don't have the finances to do that, right? They have to sit there and go, okay, if there's no path for our lead program, we got to cut it. We got to cut staff, and we got to move to our next program. Or, if they can't do that, right, they have to go, well, okay, how do we close up the company and pivot? This isn't a Pfizer or a Merck or one of these bigger companies that have the resources to keep going necessarily, right? I think the sad part too is that, they, in their confirmatory study, they did it in the same line of therapy that they were getting the accelerated approval in. So a lot of times in oncology, what happens is let's say you get approved in third line and greater for a specific tumor type based on a single arm study, your confirmatory study that the FDA wants to see in order to, make your approval a full approval, sometimes happens in one line of therapy above, right? So it'll be in second line randomized against, standard of care. What you saw with Replimune actually in their, randomized study that was undergoing was in the same line of therapy. It was in patients who had progressed on PD-1 and CTLA-4, or they weren't candidates for a CTLA-4. And it was RP1 plus nivolumab versus, treatment of choice by the physician, right? So it was a randomized study, I think for the most part, like a really well-designed study that would give an idea of like, hey, does this drug is it better than, the really crummy options that are available for the same exact patient population that was being studied in the single arm phase 2. A lot of companies don't do that, right? Like Ivance, for instance, didn't do that. Their confirmatory study is in first line. So patients who had never been treated with standard of care PD-1, they get PD-1 plus a TIL therapy. So you're kind of not even answering the question of whether that drug works in that setting. You started to see more companies do this, right? Like do the confirmatory study in the same line of therapy. So Replimune was one. There's another company called Immatics, which is developing a cell therapy for melanoma in the similar line of therapy, second line plus melanoma, that has a single arm phase 2 in that setting. And then their confirmatory study, I believe, is also in that same line of therapy. That drug AbbVie bought from Immunogen, right? Elahere, which was a full R1 ADC. Their confirmatory study was also in the same line of therapy, in full R positive. I forget which line of therapy it was, but the same line of therapy as the single arm phase 2. And so you're seeing more patients do this. That might be some guidance from the FDA. It might be like a risk mitigation type of thing. But you're already seeing like if this new administration, let's say, was focused on, hey, we don't want like rampant approvals and a rampant run on like non-confirmed studies. We really want to know, we want drugs to get to patients as fast as possible, and we want to know that they work. The system was already in place for that, right? For Replimune. Like, why not let the drug get approved? And then you had the confirmatory study to look at in the same exact line of therapy. If that failed, then you could pull the drug, right? And force the manufacturer to pull the drug. I mean, that option was clear, simple, and there. And, they didn't take it.
All right. So while we were recording, it was brought to our attention that the folks at Replimune actually issued a press release discussing that they are going to have their type A meeting with the FDA. So Kenny and I thought it would be prudent to discuss it, just given that Replimune is a really key focus of this podcast. Later, we also found out that the FDA started publicizing more of the CRLs, both for approved and unapproved drugs. And it just so happens that the CRL for Replimune was made public. Obviously, a lot of key info was redacted there. Kenny and I both were able to take a look at that. And it didn't seem like the CRL added anything substantive to the conversation based on our read. It was mostly things that were already, interpretable from the public data that was out there. But we did want to talk about the press release that Replimune put out about their type A meeting, because it's a short press release, but there was a very interesting quote in there that I think speaks to the gravity of this situation and maybe some of the strategy that the company is undertaking on, a potential path forward for them to get this drug approved. Kenny, you want to give us some highlights about the press release and then read out that quote?
Happy to, Shiva. You framed that really well, the gravity of the situation. So Replimune announced a Type A meeting scheduled with the FDA, and the company submitted a briefing book to address some of the points in the CRL. As you mentioned, Shivu, none of the points seemed novel to us. And so it's the company's way of responding and trying to find a way to work with the FDA to get this drug approved. And there's a few lines in the press release that I think are worth sharing, in particular, the latter two-thirds of a quote from the CEO. And so I'll read that to you and share some thoughts on this. So this is from the CEO of Replimune, quote, "The melanoma community, including leading physicians and patient advocacy groups, have emphasized the urgent need for access to RP1 based on the strength of the data and limited effective treatment options for this population. We remain steadfastly committed to patient access while we work with the FDA to secure regulatory approval for RP1. However, and this is key, without accelerated approval based on the current application, continuation of the RP1 program in advanced melanoma, including the phase 3 confirmatory trial, will not be viable." So this is in a lot of ways, it's easy to gloss over this, but there's a lot of density in this. And so what is the first thing you notice here? The melanoma community, including leading physician and patient advocacy groups, have highlighted the critical need of this drug. And so what I hear in that is the company laments how things have progressed, but there is strong community support. And Shivu, you mentioned that KOLs were very disappointed with this update. But I'm going to skip to the end of the quote because I think that's what's most important. Without accelerated approval and what the FDA had already committed to, let's say it that way, what the FDA had already committed to with Replimune, without that agreement, the study is not viable. The studies, rather, confirmatory trial and what the phase 2 that they had to. For a company to press release this, and then of course this becomes an 8K that's formally released, to say that this is not viable is essentially the company saying the FDA shifting its goalposts on us could kill this drug. That is alarming because you think about the need. And so going back to some of the details of the quote, they mentioned as we highlighted in the beginning, physicians and patient advocacy groups. And the company looks like it's going to maintain access to the drug. So perhaps patients that are on the study, it's ongoing. And we know that because they say they remain steadfastly committed to patient access while they work with the FDA. So one of the things I hear in this is, candidly, it's a difficult press release to read because you have a company in a very bad position where if the FDA says we need more data and we want you to run a new study and we want this control data and we need this, this, and this, and you have to find a bunch more patients. That all sounds fine in a vacuum, but operationally, when you have payroll and you have to cover the expenses for clinical trial sites and enrollment and so many other things, manufacture more drug, you are unlikely to have the funding for that. And your investors are of the mindset that, oh, the FDA is supportive of this. One of the things we heard as they did their rounds with Wall Street is that these objections that were highlighted in the CRL were not mentioned by the FDA in the mid-cycle review, and they were not mentioned by the FDA in the late-cycle review. These things truly came at the 12th hour. And so this is what's alarming about this. The company is saying, we've done what we can. We've worked with the FDA. We've maintained transparency. But unfortunately, if they move on us in this way, it might be lights out.
Yeah. When I read this, I feel exactly the same. The thing that really popped into my head was they're saying the quiet part out loud, right? Which is, we're a small company. We don't have the means to make all the changes that the FDA is requesting, that they requested at the 10th hour, basically, right? We're a small company and, we just won't have the means to do it. So this drug is gone if we don't get an accelerated approval. It's not in our best interest as a company to continue financing this endeavor, right? And I think it's really telling that they put the patient part of this in front of that quote, right? Which is a real kind of emotional plea and a bit of a like a logical plea to the FDA too, saying like, hey, all your customers basically the people that you serve, who are the doctors who are treating melanoma patients and the patients who are suffering from melanoma all want this drug. But you've come to this decision that, we didn't, the goalposts have changed, as you said, and you need to adapt to this new standard that we're putting in front of you. And so I think it's a really bold, message, I think, that they're sending to the FDA. And, it's an interesting like IR strategy in some ways, right? I think a lot of times when companies get pushed into a corner with the FDA a bit, their natural reaction is to posture with strength, or, kind of paper over the intensity of the situation. I'm having trouble coming up with like exact examples of this, but I want to say there's been a bunch of companies that have sat there and gone like, "Hey, look, we're not too worried about the CRL. Like, we have a great relationship with the FDA and great lines of communication, so we're gonna be fine. And we look forward to working with them to resolve this situation or whatever." I mean,
Mhm.
Replimune, I think, came into this with a lot of like transparency and honesty. And I think this is a continuation of like their public comments as well, which is just the realities of being a small company, especially in this more contracted funding environment that we have in biotech, saying, hey, look, this is going to be really hard for us. We don't want to do this. We want to help these patients out. We think we have a real drug here, but this is not within our power to be able to get this drug over the finish line with all these new requirements.
Yeah. I think that's right. A lot of companies, you're right, they do posture, they do position and say, "Well, look, we have other aspects to our pipeline," and so on and so on. I think Replimune is being very candid in saying this isn't gonna work, if the FDA changes its approach. So it is shocking, and the scheduling for this type A, they say they've scheduled it. It's unclear exactly when that's gonna be, but I know there's some guidance on how many days typically that is the case once they announce that this is scheduled. So, again, Shivu, I think from the patient's perspective, if you're already on the drug, you're probably gonna continue getting access. What's scary is for those who are waiting and weren't already on it and we're hoping for a better option, as much as, I would like to say that this type A, press release could be helpful, we really don't know. We really don't know if this is gonna do anything. I think one clever thing Replimune's trying to do is I think they're trying to galvanize and use this as a lightning rod for this difficult advanced melanoma community to try to pull people together to highlight how stark of a problem this can become if the FDA moves its goalposts. And the other side of it is too, isn't just about advanced melanoma and what Replimune's trying to do. What does it mean if the FDA comes in and starts changing its ideas on things that were already established a priori? I think that's also a scary precedent too, because there are patients involved here. If companies shut down, it's really that is a cycle of business life, but it's more about what are we going to be able to do for our patients who need the medicine. So
Yeah.
that's another aspect of it too. Is just very sobering and very difficult to read this candidly, but I think it was important to include.
Yeah, and I'm curious to see whether it's successful, right? I think as we've stated even previously in this podcast, there's a theme of inconsistency and instability at the larger, HHS and its, underlying organizations. And some of instability is like vacillation and, backing out of decisions that you once made and reversing them, et cetera. So, I think this drug should get approved and the plan should be maintained. Maybe there's some like minor changes to their phase 3 study design that are easily implementable post hoc that they can do. But, I'm curious to see whether this strategy by them, this PR strategy by them works. I don't know how you would handicap this, like in terms of, prediction market odds or something like that. But I think this is them putting all their cards on the table. And,
Mhm.
I respect it. I think too many times we, try and posture and paint a narrative of positivity on some of these things and false confidence. And I think it's really refreshing to see a small company sit there and go, hey, the reality of the situation. These are the hard decisions that we're having to make. Uh, we're just trying to be honest with you.
One of the things you said I think could happen. This could be because this is such a difficult patient population, they don't have a lot of options, or rather any. I could see maybe in an upside scenario, this is me projecting based on some of the things I've seen with regulatory engagement from sponsors. I wonder if what you said could could materialize. Basically, the phase 3 confirmatory study is forced to have more rigor. And we've seen some drugs. There was that Amylyx company where their confirmatory study ended up not being positive. They had to pull the drug. So if the FDA gets more stringent on those things, that seems to be a good way to continue developing the drug, having access, and confirming that there's scientific and medical merit to this, while at the same time evaluating in a way that the FDA is more comfortable. I wonder if that's the way to deal with it. Maybe we add a little more rigor, I'm making it up. But that's some optimism I'd like to share that could happen, but no substance behind it. We have to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. All right, so I think that's good. We'll continue on with the conversation. We'll splice this in, and hope you enjoy the rest of this convo.
Shivu, I wonder sometimes, you mentioned Richard Pazder. I have always thought of him to some extent as being a mixed advocate for the industry. But sometimes when you see some of the actions, you sometimes wonder, is it self-preservation? Are people taking a draconian approach because they'll see it caters well to the new leadership? And again, that's where a sponsor just gets stuck as collateral damage. That I'm just stuck in this position because things are shifting, goalposts are shifting on me, even though I've tried to do the best that I can for my patients and my stakeholders. And so that's one of the things I think about is so difficult. Essentially, our industry is anti-whimsy, but we're heading into a place where sometimes the most powerful agencies are in a whimsical place. How do you respond to that? And there's a lot of things that we see even from the White House that seem to indicate that's the approach. And so it's very difficult to make long-term plans. And so, I mentioned the Pazder and others who might be in a self-preservation mode to show, and that could have a long-term, more favorable view, because if some of those people who know what they're doing have essentially enacted a somewhat chameleon approach, where I'm going to modify my style because it's better right now for the flavors of the time, flavors of the moment. I think that's actually okay. It's just painful in the moment in transition. In some ways, I'd rather have people around the FDA right now who know what they're doing versus a bunch of new leadership who doesn't. Because what would that mean for other approvals? So let me ask you, do you think maybe this is a good time to get into, the role of a healthy FDA? And again,
Yeah.
just to remind the audience, this is from the biotech perspective. Shivu and I work in biopharma and drug development, not going to be getting into food stuff and agro and other things. And so maybe okay to get started with that, and maybe a little bit of the history of the agency.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so I think of the FDA ideally as a science first regulator, and their main role is ensuring scientific rigor in the approval, manufacturing, and the monitoring of drugs, biologics, devices. This does protect patients and establishes what is essentially a bar for quality for participants as well. And so it's easy to not remember how old the FDA is and how much change it's gone through. So I just pulled together very few points highlighting the origins of the FDA, and it actually traces back to the Civil War era when President Lincoln appointed a gentleman named Charles Wetherell as the chief chemist for a newly formed chemical division within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so USDA. And this division was initially focused on just chemical analysis related to agro products. That was around 1862. And then in 1906, the landmark Pure Food and Drugs Act, which is also known as the Wiley Act, was signed into law by President Roosevelt. And this prohibited interstate commerce in adulterated or misbranded food and drugs. So we're now trying to get more regulated with what people are consuming and essentially protect those who may not know better, marking the beginning of federal regulation. And so this was the beginning for how we think about, like, oh, there's a federal agency now watching some of these things with what we consume. And the enforcement came from the Bureau of Chemistry. So that was in 1906. About 30 some years later, in 1938, this law that I'm going to share with you is essentially the foundation of FDA regulatory authority today. This is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which was passed. This expanded considerably the FDA's authority. It required pre-market safety testing of drugs, extended regulation of cosmetics and devices, and established factory inspection rights. So 1938. Then we're going forward another 24, 25 years or so, where we have the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which introduced finally now, we're getting closer to the FDA that we know today, drug efficacy requirements and strengthen the approval process. So what does the FDA essentially need to see from medical intervention to get approved? And unfortunately, this was spurred by an awful event many of us might know about, the thalidomide birth defects tragedy. And it is true that in a lot of laws that pass in democratic nations, they're born from very awful places. And so hopefully we don't have to repeat it. But that's the origin of that act in 1962. Then I'm going to summarize essentially the 1980s to present, where over a series of smaller actions and changes in organizational behavior, the FDA further modernized, accelerating drug approvals, managing biotech products like ones from our industry, Shivu, increasing customer safety vigilance and essentially their access to knowing what that safety data could look like, addressing new health challenges. When I was growing up, AIDS was a death sentence, and now it's a very livable condition. And so the AIDS treatment and that revolution was a big part of the FDA's actions. Dietary supplements started to fall under their scope to some extent as well. And overall, the agency, as we mentioned before, is a subset of the Department of Human and Health Services, HHS, which is run by RFK Jr. And the FDA employs about 15,000 with a very large multi-billion-dollar budget. So what have we shared here? The FDA started essentially in the world of chemistry, which is the original application of all medicines. And then you see the evolution over time as we became more sophisticated, as we understood infections, as we understood other things around, the risks of if someone is not controlling this from a central location, something from Illinois can spill over to Indiana, because if it's controlled in Illinois, well, maybe I'm someone who doesn't care as much about safety, and if I can't sell it here, I'll try Illinois, I'll try Iowa, I'll go wherever I can to try to make it work. Hence the need for a central regulatory body. It kind of reminds me of the birth of the FBI in the 1900s. And so this is the foundation in a lot of ways of the FDA. And when we think about the role of a healthy FDA, ideally, if we were to talk about it for what it can do for patients, it's one that can enable innovation and be supportive. And so that's where the case of Replimune comes in, right, Shivu, where there was a significant unmet need. We know what options these patients have, which is none. And so to have someone else come in with a single arm study to get something more quickly that validates the approach of what they're trying to do, knowing that we don't need a control arm with what limited options these patients have, that is essentially one of the main functions of a healthy FDA. And then to enable the data to be shared in a clear and transparent manner. They have a lot of, when a drug gets approved, there's something called an AdCom, an advisory committee, where you'll essentially see the FDA panel go through very significant and detailed information regarding the drug. I've seen KOLs go through number needed to treat to start to see benefit. All these other things are, we start to see liver issues with a liver enzyme spike or something like that. What could that accrue to with certain patient lives over patient years to actual liver injury? Can we extrapolate that? You can actually listen to these things as a patient or just someone who's curious and learn so much. And that is one of the beautiful effects of the FDA. And typically at these adcoms, you mentioned Sarepta, at some of the more controversial or challenging diseases, there are times where patients are allowed to speak, to essentially say, I have nothing else. And without this, I have nothing. And you never want emotion to influence scientific decision. But when it comes to human life, it is a factor because the FDA doesn't operate in a vacuum. And if you know that this is the only drug that could be approved for the next several years and there's nothing else, you can't help but wonder, will some benefit? And are there ways for us to titrate essentially that if it's not optimal, what can we do to make sure that maybe we limit the amount of patients that get it because it does have some safety issues? You can do that as well. There's a lot of things in drug labels when they get approved to make it easier for doctors in the community to understand how to handle that medicine, given that it's new and it's got some risk in it. So I'll pause there because I feel like I went through a lot with the history of the FDA and kind of how I think about it. What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I think that was great. I feel like, yeah, what I always think about the FDA is their scope is a drug safe and effective? You know, it's not to make a political statement, it's not to, like do something that is trying to like stimulate more investment in a particular area. It's not to balance out markets necessarily. Like there's mechanisms for that already, right? I always look at the FDA as really putting like patients' health first. Like they don't want somebody to take a drug and it not do what the company says that it does, right? And so they're really that last line of defense for like, hey, can we trust this company? Is their drug as effective as we think, as they're saying? Is it as safe as they're saying it is? Remember, a lot of times, always, right, the FDA does their own analysis of the data. And so it's very common in oncology drugs, the labels that you see in oncology drugs. Anytime you get a drug in the mail or at your pharmacy, there's this crinkled up folded piece of paper, and they're called the package insert. We call it the US package insert. It's like a big ass newspaper that comes out, and it has all the data for that drug and like what led to its approval. If you compare the data in that to the study published like in a journal of that same data, sometimes it's very different, right? Like I remember venetoclax was this drug. There's a BCL2 inhibitor for CLL and some other blood cancers. They had in their studies their complete response rate, which is the when a cancer drug completely eliminates the tumor, it was a high complete response rate. I don't remember the exact number. And then when the FDA did their own analysis and looked at the scan, etc., it was significantly lower. The drug still got approved. It doesn't mean that it's not a drug that works or not, but it goes to show you like the FDA really, when done right, they look at things very independently without bias. And that's kind of how I view them, right? Without bias, objectively, is this drug safe and effective? Does it meet the standard of approval that we set out for it? And if it does, wave it through. Are there other, post-marketing commitments that the company needs to maintain, like, running a confirmatory study, like maintaining a REMS program to track, pretty severe AEs and things like that. But, that's kind of how I see the FDA, right? That's their job. And when they do it well, it's a good thing, right? You hit this balance this optimization, right? Of how do I ensure that drugs can move into the market at a fast enough pace and get approved, but ensure that only the drugs that are safe and effective get to market.
Yeah, and I think also, Shivu, with this idea, you and I speak almost in an optimal way. Here's how we'd want the FDA to act. I think there are times where the FDA knows it could have been better. There are times I remember the whole key tech issue from the late 90s, if you remember. That was the first time I believe the FDA was called in front of Congress. So that was an antibiotic where Sanofi, this is back when I think it was called Sanofi Aventis, was involved in some fraud. And I think it got blamed on some doctors and things like that. But it's a very interesting case where the FDA didn't immediately see that there are some sites where they enroll patients where they were not being fully transparent. And so I think a lot about this issue of transparency, and some of it when you think about the policy of the people who are at the top. So one of the things we mentioned about Marty Makary, I actually read one of his books. He's a Hopkins surgeon, and he talks a lot about how as physicians, they are not aware of the financial burden. Sometimes their recommendations, whether it's a surgery or a medicine or something else, a device, could be on a patient. And he says, what good is it for me to save a patient's life if they're now in such significant debt, they can't even live their life? And so he traveled the country, and I remember in the book talked about some of these things. And I thought it was interesting. And I was encouraged at first that there was an actual physician with practicing experience to head the FDA, because what's really interesting about the head of the HHS is he has no experience. And I've listened to him talk about healthcare, and so much of what we do, Shiva, is based on statistics, right? I am amazed at how people want to disparage data, but don't necessarily understand what a null hypothesis is. Doesn't necessarily understand, well, if a p-value is less than 0.05, what that means, or a p-value of less than zero point 0.2. What does that also mean? Can we make any implications from that? For you and I, this is the standard vernacular of our daily job. And I thought that would be the standard vernacular with, of course, much greater expertise, right? Maybe some of these people have written books on these topics. I think of people like Scott Gottlieb, who's one of the best scientific communicators I've seen in the last 30 years or so. I'm used to some extent, that kind of expertise, so that the policy lands in a place where, okay, I may not agree with it, but I understand what they're doing. I think what's interesting, Shiv, about our conversation today is a lot of what's going on with the FDA is happening in a way that doesn't make sense. I'll give you another example. I think at one of the White House meetings with the current president's cabinet, he was asking for basically status updates on his agenda. And I think this was televised. And so RFK Jr. mentioned, and this was maybe, my memory's a little hazy and I could be off, but maybe around the April timeframe, where RFK Jr. said, "Oh, yes, by September, I will have a full data update on how effective COVID vaccines are." And to me, I found that very curious because we already have a lot of data on that. Frankly, we had data on that in 2021, 2022, how effective they are. And if you want to balance the risk reward, all you have to do is go through the label and the published data to understand. And Scott Gottlieb gets into this a lot. He was one of the prior FDA commissioners who I think was one of the best in the space. And he mentions that to be too strict on human interactions when there is a pandemic, he says, has downsides to it too. And he said one of the things that concerned him was forcing people not to do certain things because the splashback can last for so long. And so he mentions, I think this was in a CNBC stop, how the anti-vax movement had just been there for decades. He said, but in a lot of ways, the COVID lockdowns gave him a reason. The vaccines, the masks, he said all these things. And so there is something in human psychology where when we're forced into a certain place, we do want to rebel. We assign it to teenagers most commonly, but I think it applies to a lot of us in different times in our lives. And I think that's also what's really interesting is from the space. I've spoken to so many loved ones, friends, people in the network about vaccines, and there's almost an indictment on the American education system where I've heard so many times people say, "Oh, I want more data on this." And then I explain to them, well, actually, the patient lives, the patient years of data exceeds things that we have for something like Tylenol. So, how does that make you feel about things? And typically the response is silence. And that's a reminder. And it's not me trying to kill conversations or prove a point. That's a reminder of the lack of understanding, but how that lack of understanding is so pervasive, it's reaching policy. That is what we're living through now. And to some extent, that's what's scary. And so, as much as I may dislike or disagree with some of the aspects of perhaps Marty Macri and others, what I like to think is their degree, their qualifications, and their commitment to patients, because it takes a very long time to become a surgeon. And coming from Hopkins, I respect a lot of what Macri has done in his career. I'd like to think that fundamental foundation will keep things together. But when you see the whimsy and the whiplash and so many random changes like Replimune and others are now susceptible to, it does make you wonder with where we're headed.
I think this is, there's a bigger theme here, right, of just organizational culture and infrastructure. Like you mentioned it a little bit up front, but we hear about it in like sports teams oftentimes, right? It's like when the owner of the team is kind of wacky and just very unstable, that instability trickles into the organization as well, to the coach, to the team, and you don't get responses, right? We're recording this at on September 2nd, so I'm not sure when we'll post it, but like the Dallas Cowboys, right? Their owners, Jerry Jones, kind of a old, like kind of wacky guy, literally traded away their best player, Micah Parsons, for like a couple first round draft picks and nothing else, right? That is like organizational instability at the top, making deleterious decisions for your organization. I mean, we see that at companies too, when new CEOs and new leadership come on board. We see that, I think now, like at the larger HHS as well, right? Like there is a specific philosophy that a leader has, and if they're not good operators, they're not good at getting people on board with their vision, whether you agree with their vision or not. That has really detrimental side effects. And especially when you're playing with something like drugs that affect everybody's life, it's really, really dangerous, right? And I think it's important to say that, like, the people who work at the FDA, like kind of who are not the appointed people, those are just, really smart, dedicated public servants, like everyday people who, maybe they were an academic in a previous life, maybe they were an MDDO or something in a previous life, and, got into this and are just lifers, right? They're apolitical. They've worked under a number of administrations and are just trying to do a really good job. I mean, you could say that about like other branches of government, right? I think we always forget that, like, even in, the State Department, or even in, the Treasury, there's all these people who've worked there who kind of make the organization function, who don't have a political agenda, or might have voted for a different president but are still operating under a different administration, or just trying to do a good job and trying to follow orders as best as they can, right? So the stuff that changes is the people on top for the most part, right? And I think it's, you know you lose a lot of, especially with kind of all the layoffs and cuts that they've been doing at the FDA staff. Not only do you lose bandwidth, you lose a lot of institutional knowledge, especially which is scary, especially when the people who are running the institution now are not people with operational experience.
I think a lot about the word that in my youth I never respected as much as I do now is consistency. And I'll share an analog with you, Shiva, when I think about the FDA. So I've registered a few cars in recent years, and I remember going through the DMV process every time here in California and thinking, wow, it's very painful. I don't recall having a DMV visit I wanted to repeat. And so there are times where if the car is new from out of state, whatever the background of the car is, there are different rules you have to apply to. And so the website does help to some extent navigate. But every time I did it, I would always supplement my visit with an AI output just to make sure I'm not missing something. And I was sitting at the DMV and I was also thinking about FDA changes. And I thought, wow, DMV is really difficult. It's quite unpleasant. Being there, going through it, knowing that they'd rather be doing something else when you talk to them. And I remember thinking, how hard would it be if the leadership at the DMV kept changing? If we had a Vinay at the DMV come in, be a maximalist for all the paperwork needed. No, you need more driving experience, and I want you to retake your exam every year.
You gotta retake your driving test every year. We gotta ensure that you're still a good driver.
And I want you your vision checked every quarter because
Yeah.
this is how I'm going to get maximal safety on the highways. And so I just thought, like, if I'm doing all this work at the DMV, how difficult would it be if things changed? You mentioned those 5 months that you shared, March to August. How difficult would it be to get a vehicle to operate if the DMV changed that much? One day we have this, one day we have that. A friend of mine that got his application rejected because of this issue. What does that mean for me? I'm going in tomorrow. How do you know what to do? And this is somewhat a flippant analogy because it doesn't involve immediate human health. Yes, we operate vehicles and there's risk to it, but I'm talking immediate health for when you're sick. So I think of the DMV sometimes as an analog for how difficult it can be and how scary a time we are in right now. And one of the best things I've heard was from an astronaut from Canada. His name is Chris Hadfield. The greatest antidote to fear is competence. And so one of the things I've done in my 2025 to deal with some of these things is to frankly learn more. If I no longer have the greatest conviction in guidelines for the flu shot, in vaccines that may be needed? Is there a new mutation for COVID? Well, I typically do fly with a mask. Do I need to consider a booster shot? It's been a while since I've taken one. I've noticed that I have to spend more time learning things, studying things, and also my primary care is an academic institution, and they told me they have their own guidelines. And when I heard that, I was so relieved that the burden is not exclusively on me. And so that's me working in the industry, wanting to know what to do best for myself and my loved ones. And I think a lot about folks who may not have that ability to dig into the space and understand all these changes. What does it mean for them? They're reliant on guidelines to some extent. They're reliant on their doctor to call them and say, by the way, you're 50, you have this, you have an existing comorbidity. I think you should consider this in the next month when you come in. What if that guidance is no longer clear to physicians? Because they have risk in what they do as well. And if that guidance isn't delivered to them, it's not clear what to do for their patients. And then things can progress and get worse even from there. And we've seen there's been outbreaks of things. This country has been clear of certain viral indications for years, and all of a sudden that may be at risk. It's a scary time we live in. And so I think a lot about consistency as being so important. Consistency impacts what Replimune's going through. And when a sponsor, Shivu, applies for a drug approval and doesn't get it, the typical response you get is what's called a CRL. It's one of the three most dreaded letters in our industry. And it stands for a complete response letter. And what it means is for some reason, your drug didn't get approved. Many times a sponsor made a mistake, but in Replimune's case, perhaps this is an example where the FDA shifted its goalposts. And so one of the things the FDA has tried to do in an attempt to be more transparent, this just happened in the last few months under Macary's administration. The CRL typically comes with a package of data, what was missing in the letter and things like that. And so the FDA has released these data sets, but they've released it in an effort to be transparent. They've released these data sets, but they've only released CRLs of drugs that eventually got approved. And while that's, I think, interesting, and by the way, it wasn't categorized. So if you wanted to find something, you'd have to go through gigabytes of data to find what you need. So hopefully, I think at some point, some database will have that aggregated. Perhaps AI, we would use AI to do that as well. But I
Absolutely. I
also
mean,
think
that seems like such low hanging fruit. Like someone should feed that all into an AI model. And we should figure out a way to buy or get access to all the ones that they didn't release, right? I mean, that's just beneficial public data. And I think, obviously, from a drug developer perspective, I think every drug developer would love that, right? How do we understand like the regulatory requirements and get a deeper connection to them so that we don't make missteps and we can get better drugs approved? But even just for the public, right? I think that's such valuable information that it seems like such low hanging fruit and an easy win for whoever's in charge.
yeah, and I think Shiva, why not just release all the CRLs? Anything that didn't get approved, anything that did get approved, things that never should have gotten that far in the first place. I think that's good to know because that type of transparency, it only will increase conviction. If I was a sponsor and I saw, oh, there are 3 companies that got approved that actually got CRLs, 1 got approved, 2 didn't. Boy, I'd like to know those lessons. Because even though you might have the best team in place, things change, things are very difficult in the space, and biotechs tend to have multiple people doing things. It's good to know as much as you can. So that's my little spiel on consistency. I think it's really important. I think the FDA in some ways is trying to do better with this new data disclosure of CRLs. And I think there's been some other updates with the FAIRS database, which is where you actually get live safety data. And so this is unregulated to some extent. And if a doctor submits a safety signal for a patient on a specific drug, it goes into this database. I think they said that was only updated at certain larger increments, and those are now supposed to get updated more regularly. So the FDA in some ways is trying, and I think that's good. What I hope that means is, Shivu, that if they're going to release this data, perhaps CRLs for only approved drugs, let's release it for all of it. I think that's where things could be headed because it doesn't make sense to give a teaser and not complete it. But that could spell for more promising times.
The, for the drugs that didn't get approved, that data is more valuable than the ones that did get approved, you know? So, yeah, I think there's some easy wins there that hopefully people with more power than us can drive towards. I mean, you brought up the point about inconsistency, and it speaks to like the thing that really strikes me is like structurally, is there an ability to like maintain consistency in this organization of the FDA over a long period of time? I think what we're, you know, it's not really a political statement. This is just an observation, but I think what we've seen over like the course of, not just Trump's administration but even previous administrations is like a gradual expansion of executive powers, right? Like there's more executive orders, so to speak, that have been issued by presidents, up until now, like with, Trump executing a lot of them. So you've seen like an expansion of the executive powers in some ways, right? And I think some of that also trickles into, these organizations, especially the FDA, which, rolls up into the executive branch, right, of the United States of America. And I think we're, kind of what we talked about with the timeline up front, right? There's clear evidence here that there are like political pressures affecting like appointments of people in positions of power, dismissals of people in positions of power, like Vinay Prasad, returns of people in positions of power. And that like speaks to lack of consistency and instability. So, I question for you, I know you've done some thinking about this too, and I think it'd be helpful for the audience to hear your thoughts about it. Is like, is there a better structure for the FDA? If we're like starting from, Kenny is drug czar for a day, or like, Kenny has Trump's ear, let's say. And you can sit there and say, hey, we should rebuild the FDA from scratch. Like, here's a better operating model for it. I mean, should it be more like the Fed, where it's independent and a little bit more immune to changes in like the political environment, right? Because it just seems like, we are in a state of kind of our country, we are in a place of more violent swings politically between extremes, as
Yes.
over the last several administrations, right? And so there are probably like functions within the government that are really essential, that affect people's lives in a meaningful way, that maybe we should keep immune or mostly immune to the vacillations of, political polarity.
I do think what you said before could be an interesting analog and case study for what we're trying to say about the FDA. And so the Federal Reserve, let's start with that one. I think that's interesting. So, what is it? Because a lot of us in the industry don't spend as much time thinking about the Federal Reserve, even though we're considerably impacted by interest rates. The Federal Reserve is a central bank of the United States, created in the early 1900s, right around 1913. And what does it do? It manages the nation's monetary policy by setting interest rates and regulating the money supply. It has two main goals: maintain maximum employment across the nation and keep stable prices. So, what does that mean in particular in recent times, especially during COVID and after, is to keep inflation bottled up in a certain place. I think typically 2% was the historic standard for inflation. And they're designed to be independent, Shivu, from political pressures, meaning that any decisions that they take on interest rates or money supply were without direct interference from president or from Congress or anyone else. And what does this independence do? It basically enables the Fed to make tough, challenging, sometimes wildly unpopular decisions without being influenced by politics. And so, what's an example? Well, if inflation's high, you're going to increase your interest rates potentially to control the money supply, to control how easy it is to get money. But that could also slow down the economy. And a president may not like that. And so, if the Fed were controlled by politicians, there would be a tendency, of course, lower interest rates, just make everything easy. But the problem is, after your 4-year term, or if you get a double term, if you get after your year, what does that mean for subsequent times? And so it could lead to high inflation and considerable economic instability at subsequent periods. And so the independence of the Fed is valuable because it maintains, what is that word we talked about before? That's not the most seductive word of all times: consistency. It maintains stability and confidence in the currency, which benefits businesses, consumers, and the overall economy. And by the way, that independence is one of the major reasons why the United States remains an economic powerhouse. And it's that trust in the institution for what it means, that no matter what's going on with the White House, the Fed's going to do what they think is best. And so, how about some times where we strayed away from this? What are some good lessons there? And so, we can take lessons at home and then we can look internationally on both sides where things weren't great and where they were ideal. And so, one example I think of where perhaps Shivu, the Fed, started to be influenced by the president was in the 60s and 70s. And so there was political interference that increased during President Lyndon Johnson's administration. And he was pressuring Fed Chair William Martin to keep rates low. And why was this? It was to help finance the Vietnam War and spending. And there was also programs called Great Society programs. And so subsequent to that, Nixon also pushed the Fed for expansionary policies to secure his reelection as well. This overall politicization essentially contributed to the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system and led to soaring inflation in the 70s. And this is something I think many of us still remember or have studied at different times. This culminated into vast economic instability and stagflation, limited growth. It was very difficult for the United States to come out of, but eventually it did. So that's an example in the United States where if the Fed isn't kept independent, the impact can last years and be extremely painful. And frankly, the United States could lose its respect as being the lead on the planet for having that stability. How about an example overseas? I think there's a really good example from Turkey, from say 2018 to just a few years ago. President, I think is pronounced Erdogan, repeatedly pressured the central bank of Turkey to keep interest rates artificially low. And the idea is, again, money is easy, you can boost growth. And this was against all the standard and conventional economic wisdom. What happened in Turkey? Well, this led to soaring inflation, a collapsing currency. We all know how important the US dollar is, right? So a collapsing currency, rising interest rates, and then you just have a vicious cycle of things get worse. He also dismissed some central bank governors who were unwilling to capitulate to his wants. And this epitomized the loss of Turkey's central bank independence. Only recently has he eased some of his pressures, allowing some stabilization. But what about the price the Turkish people have had to pay? What about the price of a president getting involved with their Fed? It's hard to trust anything over there. And just thinking internationally, Shivu, not that you and I may be interested, but if you and I were international investors, Turkey is less appealing to us right now because of everything that just happened. You don't want to get involved over there. There's just some things that are going to be difficult because you know what's happening. So the country pays a steep price. It might seem like a win for the leader at the time. Only through a myopic lens is that a win. And even then, it's debatable. So those are examples where the Fed loses its independence and things go sideways very quickly that take years to repair. But they're good examples. That's the value of studying history. How about some positive examples where maybe the Fed wasn't independent? It was something in a more dependent state, but independent rules were put into place over time as guardrails. And were there benefits? Can we know the other side of it? Well, so post 70s in some developed nations, in response to the inflation crisis of the 70s, so the same example I shared in the United States, many countries restructured their central banks to be formally independent of political change, political influence. An example is Germany's Bundesbank and the Bank of England. Two examples here, where each of the institutions gained strong legal protections for independence. And this contributed to price stability and economic growth over subsequent decades. Generally indisputable, Germany remains the economic gem of the entire European Union. When people lust over the power of the European Union, Germany's at the top for what it can do. So I've shared with you two examples. A Fed that loses independence, what's the price? United States in the 60s and 70s, Turkey most recently, a very good fresh example. And Turkey's a major international player in many things. So it's a great way to think about it. And then two positive examples where Germany and the UK didn't have independent banks. They introduced it, and now look at them today and look at the value of what that means. And so why am I sharing these thoughts around the Federal Reserve in the United States? This is an economic and financial thing. Why are we discussing it? Because you see the value of when something is independent and how for decades dividends can be generated essentially from that. And I don't mean dividends in terms of financial, I mean the benefit to all, society and others. It's what enables us to get jobs and be able to apply and just have employment and get a loan for a home, those types of things. I sometimes think of this as an interesting analog for the FDA. Should the FDA be independent in this way, where just because someone's the head of the HHS, claims to have an understanding on statistics and viruses and vaccines, comes in and says, oh, we're going to do this now because they seem as untethered to reality and data? That is not independence. That is actually a sign that the FDA is at the mercy of an individual's whims because of political shifts and political changes. So I sometimes think how ironic it is also, Shivu, that we've gone through as a nation such effort to make sure that our economics are preserved, but we don't go through the same effort to preserve our health. That to me is very interesting. And so I think the Fed could be a very good analog for the FDA to keep it independent, let it develop medicines. Look, if you want to call the FDA in front of Congress and you think something has been missed, by all means do it. And when the FDA went through that with Key Tech in the late 90s, it changed a lot of things that made things better. I'm not saying
Yeah,
let
and
them go
you
unchecked.
would still have mechanisms to, I think with kind of what's going on now with the Fed, right? The government can still remove those people from power if there's like fraud or, like criminal action, right? That is, compromising their objectivity, right? So I don't know. I think it's kind of an interesting model that we should, entertain a bit. I think the key theme there is like, how do you engender trust, right? And I think, when we look at like the Fed, for instance, it operates very independently. Obviously, you gave some examples of where, it's kind of the choice of that person who's in charge of it. Do they want to like genuflect to the the main political power at that time? But in terms of like engendering trust, I feel like the levers that like the Fed pull and push on are pretty abstract for the everyday person, right? I'm going to reduce interest rates. I'm going to increase interest rates. I'm going to, buy, more debt. I'm going to sell whatever it is, right? those are so abstract for the day-to-day person. They feel it in terms of, gas prices, egg prices, rent, etc., right? They feel it economically. The average person, I think it's harder for them to get it. Even for me, it's hard for me to get a grasp of, okay, a 2 point bump on my interest rates, how is that going to impact me on my day-to-day life? So it is like several steps removed. I think the advantage of having something like the FDA be independent is like, what medicine I put into my body is like a very lot more direct relationship with a certain institution, right? So I think it is far less abstract, and there's a way to engender a lot more trust from the common person in a area of expertise like that, right? It's like if you have a lot of trust from the FDA that, like, hey, they're not letting drugs across the finish line that are going to harm me. I trust their guidance on things. They're not swaying to political pressure. For something like drugs, I think you can really engender a lot. It's easier to engender trust in that way.
Yeah. I think one other thing that is interesting to note is, again, do we have people who understand the impacts of these choices positioned to make the decisions? And so one of the things I thought about with you probably remember RFK's testimony in front of Congress when he was to be appointed. There was one holdout, Senator Bill Cassidy, who's a physician, actually was a holdout, and he didn't want to capitulate, and so he was the last one, and so I can only imagine the fever pitch of pressure he must have endured, and my understanding was it was JD Vance, according to Senator Bill Cassidy, that convinced him and said, "Oh, RFK is not gonna do this, this, and that." And you always wonder, Shivu, how these conversations evolve because they say things, but then what happens on the other side? And RFK has been on camera actually saying he's not going to take anyone's vaccine away from them. That was actually a famous quote of his recently, not too long ago. That seems inconsistent with his behavior. So that's another question as well. Do they really understand the implications? I think Fed Chair Jerome Powell deeply understands what it means if the world thinks he's influenced by Trump. And there was a very famous interaction where Trump visited him and they had a conversation, and there was Trump was claiming that the Fed spent too much money on renovations, and he had a letter from someone on his staff that indicated that the Fed overspent for renovation, and Powell had in his mind a certain number, and Trump had a much bigger number in mind, saying, "Oh, they're spending too much, and they should essentially capitulate to whatever Trump is saying." And Powell pulled out the letter, and I thought it was so fascinating. It's all over. I think it went viral, where he had to pull out his glasses to read the document. He read it. He says, "Oh, you're counting renovations from years past. They're no longer relevant." It's a good example, and so essentially Trump was wrong, and Powell was saying that they haven't taken extreme financial leniency towards doing these upgrades or these renovations. It's just a good reminder that even in that moment with a big staff, the president can sometimes have misinformation. Misinformation at the top will flow down and have ripple effects for a long time, and have negative effects that could be quite painful. And I think part of the reason why that clip went viral is that people appreciated Powell saying, even though has a lot to lose from pushing back, he still did. He said, "No, this is not the right number." And you don't see that often in the current administration. You don't see that often with RFK in a live meeting. You don't see people push back on him. And so that's another thing as well. We don't have a lot of checks right now. That's why I mentioned to you Payasdur, who might be pushing back on some sponsors. I sometimes wonder, is that just him trying to find the right balance? Stay on the
Yeah.
tightrope because it might be better.
Mm, yeah. That's really interesting. So, I mean, I think you could probably hear it from our comments. I think at least at minimum, I think this idea of a more Fed like FDA. I mean, again, at least for the drugs division of it, is something that is a thought experiment I think others should have and see if it's something that, we think would improve things. I don't know how, personally, I don't know how, what the industry opinion on it is. To me, I think it sounds like something we should at least consider and figure out how it works. I think people's health is just too important. It's too important to be something that just, is a ship at sea and just goes with the wind, right? It should be something that is more stable and thoughtful.
Shiva, one thing, I think this is somewhat of a tangent, but I think it's helpful for people to think about is there's a lot of folks who have maybe concerns regarding vaccines or other things, and maybe people who are more favorable towards what the current administration is trying to do with the FDA and even more broadly the HHS. What I think is important for people to understand, these decisions are not made in a vacuum. Many of them are data driven and scientifically motivated. And so to disparage one part of the FDA or one part of your healthcare system is actually disparaging much of the system. A lot of how someone gives birth is based off the science of what we understand. During pregnancy, what's optimal for the baby, what's optimal for the mother. I think a lot of people don't realize a lot of the rules the FDA has for approving a vaccine apply to the same medicines a pregnant mother takes too. And so it is, again, it's the luxury you and I have of being in the industry. We know that. But I mentioned prior how it's somewhat of an indictment on the American educational system as to some of the questions we're facing. It does involve that. And so one of the things I would encourage is people who want to learn more is to try to understand versus listening to some politicians, because a great example was Trump Live, thinking that was what the cost of the renovation was, and he was incorrect. So the onus right now is on us to try to understand as much as we can. And that does make things a little harder.
I fully agree. Let us know in the comments wherever you get this podcast about what you think about the idea of a more Fed-like FDA, a more independent FDA. I don't know that either my or Kenny's opinions are really like fully codified on it. So it'd be interesting to hear what other folks think about it and how, that sort of structure, how does it sit with you? How would it work? Do you feel like that would create over the long term more trust between drug approvals and society? I think these are all really interesting questions we'd love to get your feedback on. So we hope you like this episode. I think we'll try and do more of these types of episodes if it's something that is of interest, some more kind of thought experiment-y questions that stem from really interesting trends in the news at relevant institutions like the FDA that impact kind of drug development on a day-to-day basis. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. We will be back soon with another episode. Until then, take care. Shivu and Kenny out for Drug Dealing Pod. Stay tuned for more.
Thank you, everyone.